Mr. President, I rise today to speak in strong support of the bill, the capital formation bill that we just received cloture on a few minutes ago. In a place where we often get bogged down by politics, this legislation reflects a strong bipartisan commitment to create jobs by ensuring that small businesses have the access to capital that they need. This legislation has tremendous potential to create jobs, to spur economic growth and innovation. The key component to achieving all of these goals is ensuring that small businesses have access to capital that they need to grow their business and create jobs. This legislation is a rare instance in Congress where both chambers and both parties come together to focus on this nation's most urgent priority, and that is jobs. The President has already expressed his support for it, so let's get this bill done and off for his signature. Over the past few years, I've held 12 business opportunity workshops all over the state of Montana. Without a doubt, access to capital is always one of the most critical issues that I hear from small business owners. Access to capital makes all the difference for a small business. If the money's there, so is the expansion. So is the capacity to do more research and development. So is the next great idea. Without capital, though, there is no growth, there's no risk-taking, and there are no jobs. Montana is a state of entrepreneurs. It's a frontier state. It has a tradition of self-reliance and is clearly reflected in the entrepreneurs and the successful and innovative small businesses that they have created and grown in this great state. They clearly reflect America's entrepreneurial spirit, which helps keep rural America strong and makes our economy the most innovative in the world. Our small businesses in Montana vary from family farms and ranches and one-man manufacturing shops to innovative biotech companies and cutting-edge information analytic firms. Many of these newer firms have the opportunity to change the landscape when it comes to diversifying Montana's economy. According to the research from the Kauffman Foundation, nearly all net jobs created since 1980 have come from firms 5 years or younger. The role of startups in creating jobs and driving innovation has been well documented. But that ability to create jobs is limited if these firms do not have access to financing to scale and to grow their companies. So central to job creation is making sure that investors and capital markets are accessible for startups. Because of this potential for growth, we need to do all we can to empower these businesses with the tools they need to survive and thrive at every stage of their development. These young companies must be able to access the capital that they need to bring innovative ideas and products to the marketplace. Back in July, I held the first of a series of hearings in the Banking Committee to examine the challenges and opportunities facing innovative small businesses as they try to access capital. A major takeaway from the hearing was the need to ensure that capital markets remain within reach of startups at various stages in their development, particularly in the stages before they get ready to go public. A key recommendation offered at the hearing came from Ram Bargatze, Legasite Pharmaceuticals in Bozeman, Montana. He said that we ought to take a closer look at updating SEC Regulation A to better enable small businesses to raise capital through these public offerings. The Regulation A exemption was created in the Securities Act of 1933 to provide small companies with an opportunity to raise capital without being subject to full registration with the SEC. Legasite is developing a new norovirus vaccine with the potential to prevent hospitalization and save significant health care costs to create jobs, those jobs that are jobs of the future. Working through the FDA approval process is not an easy one. It requires years of hard work, tens of millions of dollars, and it can be tough for any company to stick it out for that long for that much money. But for a small firm in Bozeman, Montana, it can be especially difficult. Access to capital to fund their clinical trials will be the determining factor in their ability to gain FDA approval. Back in September, Senator Toomey and I introduced the Small Company Capital Formation Act to update Regulation A by increasing the total amount of capital that can be raised through these offerings to $50 million while protecting new investors. Currently, businesses can only raise $5 million under Regulation A, a limit that has not been updated in nearly 20 years, and one that many view as too low to be a valuable tool in raising capital. The bill maintains the most attractive elements of Regulation A, including the ability for issuers to test the water before registering with the SEC. It also preserves the non-restrictive status of securities sold through a Reg A offering so that these securities can be resold to investors after the initial offering. New investor protections include a requirement that issuers file an audited financial statement with the SEC, a requirement that has been included in the legislation that I introduced, as well as the House bill before us today. The bill also directs the SEC to establish additional disclosure requirements and requires issuers to electronically file offering statements with the Commission. Additionally, the bill subjects those offering or selling securities under Regulation A to negligence-based liability under Section 12A2. And it includes disqualification provisions to prevent bad actors from making these offerings in a way consistent with Dodd-Frank. Now, from what I've heard some of the folks have said about the House version of Regulation A, you would presume that none of these investor protections are included. Let me just clarify that the bill that I introduced with Senator Toomey, S-1544, is identical to the language included in the House bill, H.R. 3606, that is before us today. The truth is that the substitute amendment that was voted on yesterday made very minor changes to the portion of the House bill, changed some mays to a shall, and after adding a study by the SEC 5 years after implementation of these changes. We should have been able to pass this bill by a voice vote here in the Senate, since this bill has enjoyed strong bipartisan support in the Senate, with 6 bipartisan co-sponsors. Regardless of that, I am pleased that this balanced bill also enjoyed a 420-1 vote in the House, 424, 1 against. Imagine that. All but one voting member of the House of Representatives agrees on this bill. I would also note that the SEC recently released recommendation from its Forum on Small Business Capital Formation. Increasing the Regulation A exemption to $50 million was one of their top recommendations at this forum. And by the way, this is an idea that has been on the SEC Small Business Capital Formation recommendations almost every year since 1993, the year after the limit was last raised to $5 million. So the idea that this is some risky new idea is not correct. In fact, at a briefing with the SEC a few weeks ago, SEC lawyers suggest that there is absolutely nothing scary about S-1544, and that they are very comfortable with the existing investor protections included in that bill. The bottom line is that I'm thrilled that we will finally have an opportunity to pass the legislation, hopefully very soon, and get it to the President's desk. So what does this legislation mean for Montana? Let me give you a few examples. For Brett Baker, the President and CEO of Microbion Corporation in Bozeman, lifting the cap on Regulation A offerings will provide him with broader opportunities to raise capital. Instead of worrying about where the next phase of financing will come from, he can focus on discovery and research, working with the Department of Defense to use compounds that Microbion discovered to treat antibiotic-resistant wounds. These changes will also allow a company like Microbion to access capital at an earlier stage, without diluting its earlier investors, who believed in them from the earliest days of that company. And raising capital publicly through Regulation A would also give folks in Bozeman who know about the company an opportunity to share in its success, something that's not possible unless they are accredited investors. More broadly, this legislation is going to provide small businesses in Montana's emerging data and biotech industries with new tools and options to access capital at different stages of development. And it will also provide necessary updates to existing regulations. For example, changes to the SEC's 500 shareholder rule will ensure that companies like investment brokerage D.A. Davidson in Great Falls, Montana, can continue to provide its employees with stock in the company without having to go through a costly and time-consuming registration process with the SEC. This Montana-grown company dates back over 75 years and has always believed in rewarding its employees so that they can have a stake in the success of the firm, which now operates in 16 states. Without these changes, a company like D.A. Davidson would be faced with the choice of costly public registration or potentially eliminating existing employee shareholders. And for a company like Rivertop Renewables in Missoula, this legislation will provide them with an on-ramp to go public. If that's an option that they choose to take one day, Rivertop has begun full-scale production on their groundbreaking green biochemical products used in commercial products like dishwashing detergents and de-icer. These changes will ensure that Rivertop will have multiple strategies at its disposal so that they can go public at a time that's right for them. and take advantage of the public markets as they continue commercialization of their products. And for Lance Trebish at ticketprinting.com and Ticket River, this legislation will enable him to grow his ticket printing, event management, and online ticket printing firm. Since 1997, this company has expanded its reach internationally with over 25 employees in Bozeman, Harlowtown, in Montana. This bill will ensure that entrepreneurs across the state of Montana will have a whole set of new tools at their disposal so that they can make smart decisions about their future to develop and expand business. They have more choices, better access to capital markets, which should also give them more leeway to create and innovate. We've seen ecosystems of support for small business like these spring up in Montana in virtually every county. Obviously, the success of these companies has implication on job creation and growth, but there are also tremendous opportunities for innovation. It's not surprising that in Montana, so many startups have located near universities at Missoula and Bozeman. In fact, many of these firms got their start with discoveries in the labs at Montana State and the University of Montana. With this legislation, the possibilities are endless in Montana for entrepreneurs and innovators across Montana and this nation. Mr. President, I look forward to voting on this legislation and getting it to the President for his signature. With that, I yield the floor.